Great. So hello everybody. This is part two, as it were, of some input on interpretation. As I said last time, my expertise in this, insofar as I have any, comes from being an education researcher rather than a historian. So, like everybody, well, most people in the audience, I expect, I was a history teacher for. I was a history teacher for quite a long time, 12 years in total, and during that time, I started doing research into my kids' thinking in history, because I wasn't at all convinced by the way we were asked to assess it, actually. And I wanted to really understand what was going on. And as a result of all that, I ended up working in history education in universities. But I'm an educationalist, so this is really about teaching methodology, not about content. I wouldn't claim in any way to be expert, like our marvellous first speaker on Nazi Germany. So what we've got here is some approaches to how you might think about historical interpretation, serendipitously applied to practically the same material. So you've just had a take on it all that's really all about, knowledge of the material. And what I'm going to do is come at it from a pedagogic strategy sort of angle. Okay, let's get on with it then. So I think that if you're asking just to give some more context, sorry, the presentation last week was about, what are historical interpretations? Why might they just differ from each other and so on? Not last week, the last time we did this rather. This is all about how do you evaluate interpretation. So it's got quite a narrow focus. And you can see that I've got a kind of binary here between two possibilities, what I'm calling a substantive and formal evaluation. The substantive is, if you like, driven by knowledge primarily of the period and of the archive. And what we've just had, I think, is some superb examples of substantive critique of positions. What I'm offering, I think, is the opposite of that. It's so again, I think this fits rather well together, perhaps. I'm going to be looking at formal evaluation, just asking, does it all stack up logically, if you like. So therefore, what I'm saying is applicable to any content whatsoever where you've got arguments to analyse. That doesn't mean, by the way, that it would work for any historical interpretation, because sometimes historians just tell you a story. Now, I would argue, and people like Robert Grafton and various other philosophers and historiographers would also argue, that even when someone's telling you a story, there is a undergirding kind of argument there, and you want to trace that through the footnotes and so on. But you can distinguish between times when historians narrate and when they explicitly articulate an argument. And what I'm really talking about is the latter, when people say, here is my interpretation, here are the reasons that I advance it, and so on. So I don't want to say that what I'm going to outline would work for absolutely everything. I don't think, it would be a very effective way of thinking about a historical film, for example. But yeah, when historians argue, let's analyse their arguments as arguments, is really what I'm saying in this presentation. And I've got some strategies for doing that with kids. And when I say kids, as I said also in my first presentation, I was largely a post-16 in my teaching focus, because that's what interested me more, I guess because I got to read more books. Anyway, here goes. So I'm going to approach evaluating interpretations from a formal perspective. Just to reiterate some of the sorts of things you could do when evaluating interpretations, you could ask a lot of questions about the archival traces and how well the historical book you're looking at does its archival anchorage. So is it accurate? Sometimes you can have kind of errors of reference to the materials in archives. Is it comprehensive? Does it deal with all the relevant archives for the problem, you could ask, couldn't you, as well? And are the right questions being asked? And also, are these source materials being interpreted in a kind of convincing way? So there are a number of questions you could ask about source materials and how they're used, but you could also ask questions about the sources themselves. So, what sort of conclusion can you actually mount on the basis of something? And I think what we just had is a really good deconstruction of the arguments of Galatly and so on, in terms of these sorts of issues. So, how credible is it if you just rely on oral history testimony from from people who were children through most of the Third Reich, certainly in the 30s. How credible is that? Well, what can you actually mount on that ground without the argument, your superstructure or your building sinking gradually into the mud and falling apart? But as well as asking questions then about the archival material and how it's been interpreted and used, you can also say, does what this historian is saying cohere with what we already know, or do we have reason to doubt it, or perhaps to revise what we already know? That's another way you can look at it. That's kind of moving slightly away from the evidence. Or you can just focus on the logic of what's being done, and that's what I'm going to do, so the penultimate thing here. But there's another way you can approach it as well, actually, which is, sometimes people just provide endless defenses of positions they've already articulated, and I think that's pretty boring. If someone's just endlessly trying to defend the Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution, for example, you might want to say, well, that's just getting rather dull and we need to move on. But anyway, so possible ways you could evaluate or get kids to evaluate interpretations. Here are some. I'm sure there are others. And I'm focusing on the penultimate one there, which is the logical one. So what I'm going to argue here, and this is not an original argument, but I'm going to say that we should consider historians as advancing claims to know on the basis of reasoning, even when they're telling you a story. In that case, the reasoning is in the ductwork of the references and the inferences from the references, so you can actually excavate it. But if you're going to be good at evaluating what historians do, you need to get involved in the argument, not in making claims about who they are and their biases and so on, because what we're examining is what they say, and what they say is based in reasoning from evidence. So to evaluate it, we have to look at that reasoning. And I think, therefore, that if you're going to be good at history, you need to be good at understanding the questions people are asking, because interpretations or arguments are answers to questions. How did the Nazis rule Germany? What were the motivations of the German Foreign Office? And you have to have a question. And then when you've got your question, as we said last time, you then find an archive and try and construct an answer by reasoning about the past on the basis of the evidence. Okay, so that's the approach I'm taking. It's the let's get inside these arguments. And what I'm going to use is, I'll skip that, is a set of tools really, which are they're just tools for analysing arguments. So if you this is just logic, or if you like, this is just critical thinking, depending on how annoyed you get by the phrase critical thinking. I think critical thinking is largely logic, so I have no problem with that, because we don't want to be illogical now, do we? Okay, so if you're going to make inferences, which is what you do when you look at a source and try and use it to answer a question, there's a reasoning process through which you derive a new claim on the basis of the evidence. So you say, here is my source material, here are the things it appears to say, and then you infer something about the issue in the past you want to know about. And I think we need to teach children how to do this. And I think this on the basis of bitter experience, because when I used to try and teach kids, if I gave them a paragraph and said, all right, what's the conclusion then? And you need to know that if you're going to evaluate the paragraph. Quite often they had no idea, and they would give me bits and pieces along the way. So I developed a methodology drawing on critical thinking approaches to get my students better at first of all reading a paragraph, and then obviously we can move on from a paragraph to a book, or via a chapter and so on, but also to get them better at taking it apart and deciding if they thought it was a credible paragraph. So what we're going to look at then is the kind of strategies for teaching argument analysis, and I suppose prior to that, argument comprehension. And if we don't do this, my contention is there's really no point in asking kids what they think of books, because they won't know what the historian is actually claiming if they don't understand the argument. And until they know the conclusion, they can't decide whether it's a well-formed one, and so on. Okay, so I think if you're going to do this, you need to teach people what an argument is. Kids often don't know. So there is, if you like, a baseline definition. An argument has at least two elements. It's got something I want you to believe, which is my conclusion, and it's got something on the basis of which I say you should accept my conclusion, which would be my reason for the conclusion in the simplest possible argument of all, which would be one reason and one conclusion. Now, those are rare, actually. Often you have hundreds of reasons, don't you, and complex arguments made up of layers. But let's start somewhere, and that's a good place to start. An argument is a conclusion with at least one reason for it. And the conclusion can be that you should believe something, you should understand something in a particular way, you should behave in a particular way, and so on. And these are the kind of tools, the symbolic tools and practical tools we use to make arguments. We add things together, you know, here's one piece of evidence, here's another piece of evidence, here's another piece of evidence, and then we make an inference from it, therefore. So we've got here the and symbol and the therefore symbol. And on the basis of this, you can start to model arguments. So like I said, the simplest of all would have the conclusion B, A therefore B, and it would present one piece of data and say, on the basis of this, I think you should conclude B. So A therefore B is the simplest kind of argument in the world. You can start adding more to it. A plus B, therefore C, would be more complicated, and even so, that's quite simple, isn't it? Right, so we need to teach kids what arguments are. It's a conclusion, and it's a conclusion grounded on some sort of reason, and give them some tools to model them. That's what I say. Because if you imagine a piece of text, you might give kids 2 paragraphs, 1 paragraph, or whatever. How do you reduce the complexity to see the pattern? You can underline it, you can annotate it. These are all excellent things. But I should say that, and I'm sure you found this as well, when I ask kids to underline stuff, they underline everything. So I think, as well as, you know, annotating, underlining, you should model what is being said, and these are modeling tools. Okay, here's a modeling strategy then. So imagine you've got a piece of text, and let's just start with 1 paragraph, and we're going to look at one soon, which comes back to Nazi Germany. First thing I would do is get kids to pull out the facts, okay? And that's going to be a bit of an issue, because they'll start to get a bit confused about what is and what isn't a fact. But for a minute, let's just assume we can get there. So step 1, extract the facts. And once you've done this, and by the way, you could do this with cards. I've done this using, you know, just cut out bits of paper. You've got your history text in front of you. You maybe have it on your interactive whiteboard, and you ask the kids to, you know, start to write down on these individual strips or file index cards or something, you know, what the facts are. So they're pulling the facts out of the text. So first of all, we got the facts. But then the interesting thing is what the historian does with those facts. So, you know, let's say the first fact, and I'll model this in a concrete way in a minute, what inference does the historian derive from the facts they present? You know, and imagine we've got an argument that's got 3 facts to it. It might look something like this. So we've got fact 1, fact 2, fact 3, and these are all going to lead to an overall conclusion through a process of kind of logical combination. It's just additive. You add the first one to the second one to the third one, and on the basis of that, you come up with an overall conclusion. This is quite a simple model of an argument. They might be more complicated than this, but I don't think I'd worry about that too much. If the kids started saying to me, this is too simple, you know, the first inference I can find is actually based on 3 facts, I would get quite excited, right? Because they would have got the idea, and they would be starting to pull it apart and try and reconfigure things using the tools I've given them. And that's what we want, isn't it, in education? We want to give kids tools that help them do something and see them doing it well. I've left something out actually from this presentation, so I'll inject it in now. But how do you get kids to understand the things I've talked about so far? You know, what's a conclusion? What's a fact, or what's some evidence for it? What's the process? Before getting stuck into a historian, and we're going to skip that in the presentation, but I'll do it verbally, we might want to look at some really, really simple things. So, you know, government health warnings about, you know, sugar intakes and so on. You can look at them and you can say, you know, what is the reasoning behind it? Most of the examples I can think of are to do with smoking, so they're not good ones to use in class, but here is an example. It used to say on cigarette packets, smoking, government health warning, smoking causes aging of the skin. Now that is actually a compact argument, and it goes something like this: do not smoke. And if you say why, because smoking causes aging of the skin. That was the argument. So I would spend a bit of time, before getting into the history, just making sure kids understood this. My favourite example, and I've written about this, I think, in Teaching History from, I think it's 2006. There's an article called about asses, archers and assumptions. I think it's from 2006. You could use this example, which is one from a critical thinking textbook. So if you say to somebody, watch out, there's a polar bear behind you, that is actually an argument. Kids don't see that until you walk them through it. So the first thing I would do is put up, watch out, there's a polar bear behind you on my board, and ask them to actually tell me what the conclusion was. Well, it's fairly obvious. You should watch out. Right? And then what is the reasoning? Well, you should watch out because there's this ravenous polar bear behind you and it's going to eat you and so on. So let's get back to history. But what I'm saying then is we want to do argument modelling. And this is actually to do with, moving things around. You could do it just by writing things. You could do it on a computer screen. You just drag and drop. It's, anything you like. But the point is to model the argument that's in the text, to transform the continuous prose into a logical structure, to see how it works, to make sure you can work out what's actually being said. And then once you've done that, once you have the argument, only then can you start to try and analyse it. And as I say, this does come from bitter experience, because I found that I would be asking my kids, what they thought of the argument of X, Y, or Z historian, Galately or Brozat or whatever. And it was just obvious to me again and again and again. They hadn't got a clue what was being presented to them in this, 300-word gobbet they were given in their A-level exam, for example. So the point of doing the modelling then is to help them really grasp what's going on. Only when you've done that can you evaluate it. Let's do something practical then. So I'm not going to show you this because I don't know how to do that on Zoom, but this is from the rather excellent, but now rather old, I guess, television program, The Nazis: A Warning from History. And in that program, episode 2, I think, is called Chaos and Consent. And it's about how Nazi Germany was ruled. Ian Kershaw is the script editor and so on. And it's pretty much arguing, as I recall anyway, largely the consent side of the argument that was referenced in Chris's superb presentation. So what you have in about less than 2 minutes actually is Robert Galately summarised. And I'm just going to, and I have got my kids in the past to take this apart, model it. In a way that's unfair because Robert Galately has written books, plural, on Nazi Germany. So simply taking a paragraph from bits of a film clip is a bit unfair. But what can I say? I mean, as a teacher, I need to simplify things. So here is the text. I just want you to have a quick look at it. It's a classic sort of example of the kind that Chris has just been taking apart. And if we were in a room together, I'd now spend 5 or 6 minutes actually getting your reactions to it. But I don't think I can do that, so I'll just press on. But if you have a look, I'll read it out. So, far from there being, Galately says, a Gestapo officer on every street corner, there were only 28 secret police officials for the entire Würzburg region of nearly 1 million people, he says. I think the Gestapo could not have operated without the cooperation of the citizens of Germany. By that I mean, it really would have been structurally impossible for them to do so. There was simply not enough Gestapo officials to go around. Somewhere between 80 to 90% of the crimes that were reported to the Gestapo came from ordinary citizens. The main job of the Gestapo was sorting out the denunciations. That's what Galately says, sitting in the archive in Würzburg, discussing his research on television. And if you said to try it next time you're in class, get your kids to look at this and say, what's the conclusion? They struggle. What would you say, actually? I'll just give you a chance to put it in the chat if anyone wants to. We could try and go interactive on this. It might work. Can I see the chat? I can't see the chat. Don't do that then.
I can see the chat, so we can...
Okay, excellent. So could anyone like to hazard a conclusion then? What is the conclusion? And to put this in kids speak, what is the really big point that he wants you to take away here?
We've had a response, Arthur. The conclusion being made, conclusion being that the citizens themselves took on the role of the Gestapo, ? Or the Gestapo weren't that big and were dependent on the fear of the people.
Okay, I don't think that's right. And that shows you why this is quite difficult, doesn't it? Because if that is the main conclusion, then everything else should support it. Yeah. And the point about the Gestapo, the people doing the policing of themselves, that is supported by some of these facts, but not the others, not as directly as possible in my contention. So I think what was just being said is definitely the inference drawn from somewhere between 80 to 90% of the crimes reported to the Gestapo were based on denunciations. But I'm not sure that that would account for, how does that support the fact about the limited number of police? In my contention, the conclusion is in the middle. Kids tend to go for the end, and often it is at the end. Sometimes it's at the beginning. But I think the conclusion is in the middle. Terror is structurally impossible. The police operated with cooperation. I think that's what's being said. Let me try and get you there. So going back to this model, what are the facts? There aren't that many facts actually in there. Maybe that would be a good way to start. If we underline the facts, what are they? In my contention, there only are two, and here they are. And these, what I mean by facts, these are statements of what he thinks was the case, not on what he thinks they mean. So on the basis of these statements, a larger claim is made. That's my argument. So in the archive, he's counted up the number of secret police in Würzburg, and he's just put a ratio there, secret police versus population. And on the basis of that, we've got an inference. And there's actually quite a lot going on there. You need to add some additional premises to make that really stand up. But I think that's the kind of thing that Galatoli is doing. He's saying, right then, we've got hardly any police. It's not enough police. It's not enough police for terror. So I rule out the totalitarian view. And what do you do with the denunciations? He's counted in the files. How many of them were reported by police officers? Hardly any, between 10 and 20%. 80 and 90% people writing in about, my neighbor does not respond to the German greeting. My neighbor has suspicious looking friends. I think she might be a lesbian or something, is one of the examples that's used in that program. And on the basis of that, we have the conclusion that it was the people policing themselves. They were denouncing themselves. And I think we end up with something like this as the overall kind of position. You couldn't have had terror. And anyway, it wasn't needed because the people were actively supporting the regime. There wasn't a need for a larger police because this was a popular regime. So popular, in fact, that the people kept denouncing those who they thought were enemies of the Reich. That's kind of what Galatoli does. And so once we've got kids to model it, and as you can see, it's not that easy, right? We have to practice this. And given that, we need to go quite slowly if we're going to get children evaluating historians. It's not easy. What do you do once you've done it, though? And how do you get them, more importantly, is do the analytical things that we're expected to do in the exams, which is take this all apart. So I think there are various things you can do. And what Chris was doing earlier is absolutely superb and much better than me, and because I don't really know the material anything like well enough to criticize it and evaluate it substantively in terms of pointing out that it's not enough to talk about the secret police. What about the Kripo? What about the ordinary police? What about the order police? And what about the other security apparatus? What about the stormtroopers? That's the kind of thing you would do if you're using facts to critique it. Let's take apart the logic. There are two things you can do, and this comes from critical thinking. You can ask what's assumed, what is taken for granted in the argument, but not explicitly stated and not explicitly grounded. To go back to my polar bear, watch out, there's a polar bear behind you. That actually assumes quite a lot of stuff, some of which could be false, which is why it's a weak argument unless you expose the assumptions and show that they are credible. So the polar bear could be dead. It could be a stuffed polar bear. Right? If there's a stuffed polar bear behind me, why should I give her monkeys? Or alternatively, what if I am a fearsome, notorious, and utterly crazed polar bear wrestler? If there's one behind me, maybe that's my zone. Maybe that's me happy. So what is being assumed in an argument? What is kind of taken for granted but not stated? Quite often, it's a really, really weak thing. So that's a good tool from critical thinking. Another one is this. This can get really silly, so you have to impose some discipline, right? What else could we conclude from the evidence? And this is where kids might say ridiculous things like, we can conclude that the Germans were ruled by alien forces or something. But yeah, you have to say, what can you conclude that's consistent with the other things that we know? And if you can come up with a pretty good logical inference that's just as good as the one that you're reading, then that should make you want to ask more questions about the argument. So we're going to try these both out. The assumption spotting. Are there hidden assumptions in Galately's argument, and are they credible? And we're going to try can we do something else with those facts? And then I'll show you what some kids have done, actually in two contexts. A-level students that I taught and undergraduates who we got doing this too. And if you wanted, there's a page on the website of Edge Hill University where some of this material is, so you can just go and download it if you wanted to, including a little presentation which I'm going to have to show you as a slideshow, not a film, because I don't know how to, but that's the link there, and the presentation will go up, and you can stream it from the Boulder page and find that link to your heart's content. But and there's another good example there, by the way, of something to use to help kids understand argument, which is the Monty Python argument sketch. It's mildly rude, so you want to consider the age group of the kids. But yeah, that's really funny, and we use that with the undergraduates to get them to understand what an argument was, and then we present Galately, and then we take it apart in a scaffolded way. But yeah, here is the example. So, and this is just a little film. It's a 2-minute film. I'm going to flick through it. So this is one way of getting people to think critically about the argument without doing that modelling yet, actually. Okay, so first of all, you give them the context. Historians disagree about how the Nazis ruled Germany, and we've got the terror versus consent, rather like that film, the BBC one from 1997, Chaos and Consent in the Nazis Warning from History. And then, we're just going to look at one instance. This was done in a program that didn't allow umlauts, by the way, so I apologize to Würzburg for not configuring them orthographically in the right way. Okay, so we've got Galately, and you present the students with the facts, and you ask them, what can you conclude from these facts? Maybe pause it, maybe get them to draw some conclusions. So we've got 28 Gestapo and 1 million inhabitants. What can we conclude from that? We have the second fact that I reduced before about the denunciations. What can we conclude from that? Here's a conclusion. Do you think it's a reasonable one? A bit of class discussion might be good at this point. We could infer that the people were terrorized. They were constantly watched by the secret police. We could infer that that was not possible because there were too few, which is what Galately does. From the denunciations, we could start to wonder about motivation. And this is where the Galately argument takes us. The denunciations allow us to infer consent. Maybe that's why there were so few police. You can see how, when your inferences start to stack up, you start to think, I'm onto something. So this may be quite a plausible argument. And actually, most of the time when you present it to students, they haven't had the benefit of Chris's critique first. And, they go, wow, this is so compelling, I'm totally sold. But then we carry on and sort of probe this a little bit more. So we have to ask, this is the assumptions test, what are we assuming in those previous arguments? And is that a credible assumption? How about this? Kids like this one. How many police do you need to terrorize? I don't know if people have got any views on this, but the thing that always comes to mind for me is just after, I can't remember whether it's before or after 9/11, but there was an anthrax scare around about 2001. And what it was someone was sending anthrax through the post. But I lived in New Malden, in just near Kingston and Wimbledon down there, and there were people selling gas masks on the roundabout on the end of my street, all because one guy, it turned out, when they got to the bottom of it, in America had been sending anthrax through the post. So I think you can, you don't necessarily need a high ratio to do your terrorizing. So irrespective of whether or not Galately's situation model of Nazi Germany is credible, like I said, you can't just talk about the Gestapo, what about the Kripo, what about the other police, what about the stormtroopers? Putting all that aside, to one side for a minute, there's a premise here in the assumption that 28 is not enough, wherever it was. Yeah, there's a premise in this argument, which is actually highly questionable. What is enough? How many do you need? And kids will have views on that. And what we're doing here is exposing the ductwork of the argument. And I think you've got to do that if you want them to reason with the historian's account. What about this, though? This is gobsmackingly important, isn't it? The Gestapo, I mean, my German is appalling, but it's the Geheimstaatspolizei, I think. So it's the secret state police. Now, Galately is sitting in the archives in Würzburg. He knows there were 28. What did you know if you were living, just down the road from Gestapo HQ, about how many Gestapo there were, how many informers there were, how many undercover secret police there were? So, and then you can get back to the previous question about how many people do you need to go terrorize? We don't know who these people are. We don't know who the secret police are. We don't know there's only 28. What we do know is that, my neighbour's neighbour isn't around anymore. We're not quite sure how. We don't know where they've gone. Or maybe we do. Maybe we've heard they've gone to Dachau. But, there's not full clarity about process here. I can't put a freedom of information request in to establish whether my neighbour's wife is a Gestapo informant. And finally, let's take apart the denunciations. And you can really linger on this one with kids, because they've got lots of insights into dobbing people in, into telling tales. It's one of the big issues, isn't it, as a kid? People are always, it's the micropolitics, isn't it? Who's saying what to whom about who? Why might you go tell teacher about somebody? It's not a perfect analogy to talking to the secret police. Teachers are lovely, so the thing breaks down. But nevertheless, what might your motivations be? And it's fairly obvious that we can have an alternative conclusion from the inference that says they told the secret police because they loved Hitler or they liked Nazism. One obvious reason for telling the secret police about someone else is to show that you yourself are a credible, trustworthy, good member of the Volk who's supporting the regime and loves the Führer and does the German greeting every time you come past somebody else and so on. So denouncing people can be a mechanism of self-defense as much as a mechanism of endorsement of a regime. Denouncing people can be a cynical maneuver for some other reason. I fancy my boss's job. What if I, get him arrested? That might be interesting. So there are alternative conclusions that can be drawn from the data. Okay, so let's go back to the model. So you don't have to use this model, but I mean, you can see then the previous thing, that's doing the reasoning deconstruction verbally without a model. Whatever works, works, doesn't it? But let's go back to this and apply the alternative conclusions test and the assumptions test to it. It's fairly obvious that it's quite criticizable. So, as I said, how many secret police do you need? So the first inference from the first premise is a questionable one rather than one you should feel obliged to accept. Furthermore, as I said, was it known that the police were secret? So on the basis of that, we can establish an alternative conclusion. So what we've got here is we've critiqued the conclusion because it rests on premises about how many people you need to do terrorizing with, and we can mount our own conclusion on the basis of the facts, which could be a counter conclusion. Also, what are the motivations behind those denunciations? There are plenty of alternative conclusions that could be drawn. So the second inference collapses also, or at least becomes questionable until further contextual research has been done to ask the question, how plausible are these alternative conclusions? Because it could be that they're implausible. But we know from what Chris was saying that the alternative conclusions are eminently plausible rather than implausible. So I think we've got quite a weak argument. It makes assumptions that we might want to question, and it draws conclusions to which we can present alternatives. So that's the idea, really. Here are some examples of kids' reasoning, and I don't know what you think of them. Let's linger on them for a minute. So I've asked, there are three examples here, and then there's the undergraduates. These kids are supposed to be, they were actually arguing online about terror and consent in Nazi Germany. I set up a discussion board with my students who were in Cornwall and a friend of mine's students who were in Surrey, and they argued with each other about interpretations of Nazi Germany and Galately, and we introduced some of these ideas. I don't know what you make of this. The evidence can be interpreted in different ways, the kid says. The Gestapo was short-numbered. Some people might say they could still terrorize because there's the camps as well. And if you put the Gestapo and the camps together, maybe there's more terror. Or others would say it's structurally impossible. People have different opinions, blah, blah, blah. They understand some of this, don't they? They understand that camps and terror need to be considered, and that Galately hasn't mentioned camps. But they don't actually really articulate what his argument is. They just repeat it, the structural impossibility. So I would have doubts about whether they fully grasp this. And they are, if you like, fence-sitting, aren't they? They haven't actually made a decision. They said, well, you could say this, you could say that. What do you know? And I would be a bit disappointed if that's all I got out of my class. How about this one? What do you reckon? Does this give us more grounds for hope? So it's clear the Nazis did exercise terror, although evidence would suggest it was applied only when absolutely necessary and with the consent of the people. It's structurally impossible without their approval. So, you can carry on looking at that. And what we can say is they've understood Galately and basically reproduced it with additional supporting information. So I've no evidence here that they've got beyond modelling the argument properly. I'm more confident than with this previous one that they actually understand what structural impossibility is. But there's no evidence here of anything other than just, oh, that's really good, I'm going to repeat it and adduce more stuff. Whereas here, what do you make of this? What I make of it is that they know what they think. So we start with a clear conclusion. They are putting up in line one their view. And now they adduce evidence for it, and they know more. So, obviously logical analysis is not enough. You've got to know something, haven't you? But they know more, but mind you, the previous person did as well. They know about alternative interpretations. They find Michael Burley in his 2003 book much more plausible than Galately. But if they just stop there, that wouldn't show me they'd learned to reason. What they do in the final paragraph is provide an alternative conclusion using Galately's data against Galately. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I hope I am, I'm probably not. So what you've got there then is some evidence in the third case that the student can do the reasoning, critical evaluation, rather than just do the reiteration and additional elaboration. So, good evidence of reasoning there. Here is an undergraduate. So I'll just pause for a minute so you can decide whether you think how much further they progressed than the A-level student. But yeah, this is a year one undergraduate in term one. And what they had, by the way, was they had that video, the white text on the black background, just getting them to think about the arguments. I suppose if you wanted to be critical of it, you could say they're just repeating what the video said, but actually I don't think they are, because if you remember the video asked questions, it didn't tell you what to think, it just raised the questions. And I would want to contend that they have raised those questions and decided what they thought on the basis of them, and articulated a coherent position as a result. But that's the long and the short of what I wanted to say, really. And I think this methodology, it is content irrelevant in a way, because it's about logical analysis. And logical analysis is simply saying, you know, what is being claimed, what is the structure that leads to the large claim, and how robust is that structure? Can we give it a poke? Will it wobble? Can we give it a poke and will it collapse? Or is it actually robust, plausible, and so on? And really what I'm arguing is that if we want children to engage in historical argument, writing their own, it helps if you do this, because they can then construct better arguments on the basis of their evidence they're given and so on. But if we want them to do the two things that are required at GCSE and actually A level, which is, you know, explain what someone's arguing and then provide an evaluation of it, I think we've got to teach them what an argument is and how to analyse one. At the end of this, there are some things you can read, and if you want to access them, I've got them all on a IOE Academia Edu page, which is a sort of free page from which you can download stuff. So I'll again, you can get that from the stream version of this. So I'll stop and hand back to Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. I thought, again, absolutely excellent, and a second fantastic talk from you, and we're very grateful for you being a kind of friend of Beebold history. So thanks very much. Yeah, I thought absolutely fantastic. There's been a couple of questions already. So the first question, my focus is at GCSE and Key Stage 3, and I was drawn to your polar bear analogy. These sorts of simple ways help teachers unlock the mystery behind the issues of deciphering interpretations. And I wondered if Arthur had other advice about how to introduce the larger topic of interpretations, etc., or I guess relating to other content, to younger pre-A-level students. I guess the first thing I'd say on that is I benefited from this talk from Arthur about 3 years ago, when I was a head of history at another school in Hounslow, and I've used it with my A-level students, but I've also at my new school, Boulder Academy, you started to use elements of what Arthur's done today with Key Stage 3 students, especially the first sort of stuff that Arthur was going through in terms of unpicking what an argument actually is. So it can be done, it has been done, and it is, if I compare my students at Boulder Academy to my students in my previous school at kind of similar ages, it has had a profound effect on their ability to both decipher what an argument is and make their own arguments. And students through guided reading across this year, and I know other teachers from Boulder Academy, some of which are on this call, would echo this, have been able to critically engage with lengthy extracts from historians with increasing strength throughout the year, the more that we've exposed them to it and the more that we've reminded them of what an argument is. So it can be done, and it does work with students before A-level. But Arthur, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, this is an interaction, this presentation is an interaction between two things. So I was a head of history, and also I had the poison chalice of being in charge of general studies. Well, I don't know if anyone else does that, but you know, you have to harass other staff into teaching cumulative frequency for you and things like that, and it doesn't make you very popular. And you also have to enthusiastically talk to students about absolutely anything, you know, beyond your expertise, which is embarrassing as well. But what I decided to do was get rid of it as a result, and I introduced a whole load of AS levels instead. So there was a public understanding of science, there was a citizenship one, and there was a critical thinking one. And we gave people choices rather than just general studies, and it was very popular actually. But on the basis of that, I had to learn to teach critical thinking, and that's when I realised, I started giving my history students passages and asking them what the conclusion was, and they just didn't have a clue. So I thought, this is really interesting. All these years I've been teaching history, and I haven't been teaching them how to think about the history they're reading. So I started to use the critical thinking methodology in my history classes. as well as using history to look at critical thinking, because, you know, witch crazes and things are really interesting. You can deconstruct them, analyze them, and whatever. But as part of all of that, I was responsible for a couple of years for running a kind of link with a local school, a feeder school into my sixth form college, and a gifted and talented program for their year 10 and 11s. And we use this methodology to teach them all the time. And on the basis of that, I wrote an article in Teaching History. So I think it's 2006. It's called Asses, Archers and Assumptions. And it's about using this methodology. And there are quotes there you can see from year 10s and year 11s. And we were using it to look at archaeological inferences and how credible they were. And you can take very, very basic interpretations. So the one I discuss in that book there, article rather, is about the Amesbury Archer. There was an amazing, I was teaching down in Truro in Cornwall, and there was a really interesting archaeology in our college actually. There were round houses being found when we were digging up for new buildings, but there was this really good case in the papers about a rich burial found near Amesbury. And we just take things like, you know, the BBC headline and then look at the evidence and see how credible that was as a conclusion. So the BBC called him the king of Stonehenge. You know, to answer that question, you'd have to know about social structure around that time, so 2200 BC. And talking about a king is really pretty implausible. So, but you could look at what the archaeologists did, which is they described this find as the Amesbury Archer. In other words, they classify him as an archer. But if you then look at the assemblage and the burial equipment, there's an awful lot going on apart from archery. So using this kind of modelling of reasoning, I was getting year 10 just to kind of rip into these analyses. And I did that also in Lancashire as well with year 10. So this kind of thing works with year 10. But how do you introduce interpretations to kids? Have a look in Teaching History. There's loads of really good examples. Steve Mastin does brilliant things on the Empire. Jane Card, superb stuff on periodization and envisaging things from, you know, looking at Victorian paintings of Tudor executions and things like that. My favourite is an example, quite old now, from 2006, done with year 6, and it's really good. It's a scheme of work that is partly on the HA website, but I can email it to you if people want it, because I saved it before it vanished from the internet. But asking the question with year 6, why do historians and filmmakers say different things about Alexander the Great? That was the question. Now that's a really accessible question. You just need the film trailer from Alexander the Great. You need an example of historical text. You know, how do these two genres operate? What's the difference between them? That's what that scheme of work was about. And in my opinion, I know some people won't like it, but I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It was, I think it was Geraint Brown and possibly Matt Stanford at the time at Cottenham Village College, I'm thinking. Working with their local feeder school. There's an article about it in Teaching History, I think from 2006. Now I think about it, I'm not sure it was Matt Stanford, definitely Geraint Brown anyway. And that's on primary, secondary liaison, showing you that you can do interpretations work with year 6 if you frame the question right. I'm talking too much.
No, I think that was very valid and very, very useful. And thank you for the offer to share resources. I'm sure many people will take you up on that, including most likely myself. So another couple of questions that have come in. How might we adapt this methodology to other topics? Are there any specific topics you think it may work well with, in addition obviously to Nazi Germany? They only teach GCSE, but would like more historical interpretations that they could cover effectively, and that's from Eloise.
As I said at the top of it, really, I mean, if you take narrative text, it's much harder to work out the inference process that's embedded in it. So the kind of thing I had with Galately, if I just show it to you again, it's not really a narrative. It's a summary interpretation. And so what I'm doing here is most amenable to use with summary interpretations rather than historical narrative. Because to work out how a narrative works as an interpretation, you really have to have proper history rather than, let's say, a textbook paragraph. And you have to be doing quite a lot of toing and froing between the quotes, the narrative and the footnotes, actually, to reconstruct the reasoning. So but you need summary interpretations, and they're available all over the place. I mean, you often find them in textbooks. You certainly find them at the end of chapters, and so you don't have to hunt too hard to find them. I mean, my favourite example, it's actually a different ream, but there's a great page at the end of a chapter by Robin Blackburn from his book, about the abolition of slavery, 1988 book by Robin Blackburn. The last paragraph of the chapter on British abolition is just a perfect logical statement of his conclusion, rather like this, So this methodology works wherever you've got a historian saying, all right, well, here's my argument. And they tend to do that, in their conclusions, sometimes in prefaces. It doesn't work so well for Simon Sharma telling a story, because to really work the reasoning process out there, you have to construct the evidential basis of the story. But and the methodology I've been suggesting is just a critical thinking methodology or a logical analysis of an argument, and it will work for any argument whatsoever, which is the criticism of it. People will say it's totally generic, and yes, it is. You don't always have to be specific. These are not mutually alternative approaches. As I said, going back to the beginning of this, you can do lots of substantive evaluation, and if you didn't do it, that would be foolish. And what we had in the first presentation was a superb example of how to actually ask, does the evidence sustain the kind of inference you want to ground? Can you really say that? What about these other facts, and so on? But yeah, all it is a logical analysis, and logic is a generic thing, so it should be applicable to absolutely anything.
Thank you. We've had two more questions, one from Katie Matthews, and I think we might come back to that at the end, because one question from our previous presenter, Dr Dillon, has come through that I think probably relates to this a bit more whilst we're on the topic. So he says, to what extent are pupils influenced by the writing style of historians? Are they overawed or alienated by technical language or technical vocabulary, for example? I think here actually I might posit some form of an answer as well, in that my experience, especially this year, as I mentioned at Boulder Academy, we have we've only got year 7 and 8, we're a startup school, and we've exposed our year 7 and year 8 to extracts taken directly from historians, as I know lots of history teachers do. And I've used kind of guided reading very widely here, lots of techniques that I've taken from Twitter, especially Simon Beale and a few others on Twitter. And in my experience, and I'll be interested if other history teachers have found the same, or equally Arthur, feel free to come in as well. They can be, but it's about thinking carefully about what extract specifically you're going to use. And I think that comes into what Arthur was just saying about selecting an appropriate extract to show that argument and really show what you want them to understand from the text. But also, to a certain extent, it's about pre-teaching as many of those technical terms as possible, all through guided reading. When you're, first of all, in your questions, I give them a synopsis of what each paragraph is about in a sentence first. We then give them comprehension questions, which are largely multiple choice. We spoke to a SEN consultant who suggested that is much more accessible to our lower ability LPA students. And then they're kind of progressively increasing to kind of higher order questioning about the argument itself and about what their conclusions are. We also kind of pick up on particular words in the text, technical words that they may not have come across, and give them definitions along with pictures. And I use something called the Noun Project, which if people haven't come across is fantastic. They give a picture, a dual-coded kind of image to go with any word, and you can search all sorts of words on there. It's brilliant. So that's what we're doing at Boulder to kind of combat that. And again, I stress it is not just us that is doing that, and lots of these things aren't my ideas initially, but I found that does make historians accessible even to year 7s. There was also a great article in Teaching History last year, about this and about how you do it from year 7 onwards, that spoke about using simpler, maybe more narrative-based text first. And we also do that. So the first text that they're exposed to in year 7 is Ian Mortimer's A Time Travelling Guide to Medieval England. By year 8, they're reading Ola Sugar when we do Migration Through Time, for example. And year 9 that I'm planning at the moment, they'll be reading extracts from Kershaw, from various historians. So it can be done, but it's about systematic planning, I think, is the key. Arthur, I don't know if you have any thoughts as well on that.
I think, yeah, it is very, very difficult, and we shouldn't underestimate that. I mean, I'm actually astonished by this. There's a lot of talk, and it's excellent. I thoroughly support it. At the moment of always framing everything around a historian, and that just frightens me a little bit, because it took me so long to get my sixth formers to be able to read even short paragraphs. So I suppose it depends on your kids, let alone getting them to read an entire book. But yeah, I mean, everything depends on the school you're in. I've always taught in totally mixed ability context by and large. Though, mind you, by the time you got to the A-level, the sixth form, of course, it's not that mixed, is it? But whereas, if you're in a highly selective school where kids have really, really high literacy, and I don't know, it depends. But in any case, wherever you are, it's really, historians do write in difficult ways. What I'm doing here about reasoning and logic would apply to any writing. Historians tend to write in quite specific ways as well. And it's quite difficult to grasp those. What I mean by that, and I'm just going to refer you to somebody else. So James Carroll, or Jim Carroll, I don't know if people know him, but he's on Twitter. He's at J Carroll History. So that's 2 R's and 2 L's. J Carroll History. He's written a whole series of brilliant articles in Teaching History on how historians write and why it's challenging, and how we have to teach people to write like that themselves, but also to understand what's going on. So one of the things Jim talks about a lot is nominalization, which is where something is turned into a noun, and this abstraction is then used in a sentence to command a verb. You end up with these strange abstract sentences, and it's pretty astonishing for kids. But you can get them to read all of this if you teach them. And Jim Carroll writes about it brilliantly in Teaching History, in the Curriculum Journal, but also on his blog, which is jcarrollhistory.com. So there's some great things there on teaching reading, and generally I defer in all things to do with historians' language to Jim, because he's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I'd echo that. The things that I've read from his in Teaching History are absolutely fantastic. So yeah, if you've not engaged with them from Jim Carroll, do, because it's brilliant. Just a
quick thought there. I mean, so plurality, right? So this is the thing. If people say something to you, often people go away thinking they're saying that's all we should do. By no means. So work hard on the language, on the Jim Carroll approach. I'm simply recommending logic. By itself, it's no use. You need to have the substantive valuation. You need to know the sources. You need to develop knowledge. All these things together would be the ideal. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify for everybody as well, I'm not in a selective school. So our school is an inner city London academy, and we have about 40% pupil premium. And I'd really encourage people to start to expose kids to historians young, because having been a head of history at another school and now doing it at this school, and being able to have the freedom to start from afresh, really, with year 7 and year 8, it really can be done. So yeah, that's sort of my rallying cry, I guess. Last question from Casey Matthews. Is there the potential issue that students may begin to simplify how historians form interpretations? Arthur?
Yes, possibly, but not if you teach them other things as well. So remember, in the first talk we were talking, let's say, about the marvellous work that Kate Hammond's done on historical methodology. So going back to Galately, I mean, what we've got actually is history from below, haven't we? This sort of social historical approaches, history of everyday life, that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, you need to teach more things than this. And if one just taught this, it would be somewhat simplifying. But in the first of these sessions that we did, it was focused on helping kids understand different research methodologies and so on. So yes, you need to do more than one thing, and make sure that you try and reflect the wider approach. Because I mean, you could criticize, Galatly, without doing what we've been doing here, you could ask, how much can you infer from one case study? Würzburg is, one of the few places where there weren't many complete Gestapo archives, I don't think. Chris will correct me, I'm sure, but Würzburg was one of them. And how far can you draw inferences from that? And what are the limitations of your research strategy if all you do is go to Gestapo archives? There are other questions you could ask. And we should ask lots of different questions, not just rely on one approach.
Thanks. We've also had, there's no more questions, we'd be pleased to know, but we've also had, Jacob Owen has just shared kindly that apparently the teaching history article about Alexander the Great is called "It's Like They've Gone Up a Year." It's like they've gone up a year. So
thank you. That's the one.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, I think that was fantastic, an absolute tour de force again, and thank you everybody for being here. And again, a massive thank you to Arthur and to Chris, who both delivered fantastic talks. As before, as with the previous meeting, this will or has been recorded and will be made available on YouTube afterwards. Please go and share widely and shout as loud as you can and let people know about this network that we're setting up, because there will be lots and lots more events. In actual fact, our next event that's booked, and there may be more booked in the interim, will be with Dr. Claire Cannon, who's a medievalist, on Wednesday, the 15th of July at the same time, so from 4 until 6. And she'll be talking about exploring everyday life in the 14th and 15th centuries. She's going to, in particular, she's going to focus on source material and material culture, and using that ideas for how we could use that in the classroom. If you haven't come across Claire before, she's fantastic. She's worked as part of the Royal Holloway Citizens 100 project for the last 2 years or so. She's just moving to Reading, I think, at the moment, Reading University. But she's done a lot of action research in the classroom and worked an awful lot with teachers and with the Historical Association, etc. for the last few years. So yeah, please do join us on Wednesday the 15th. Once again, massive thank you to Arthur and Chris, and thanks very much for being here and supporting the network. And yeah, please join us again on the Be Bold Network. Thanks very much.